So I was thinking actually the same process as happened like with the Pali Canon and the songs of Milarepa also happened in with the seminars that Bhante gave. You know, in these volumes that we've now got, it's all been tidied up. It's made very readable, but it actually comes out of living situations. Bhante in a room with often young men, women, really opening up the Dharma over several days. And yes, the time, just a very really exciting sense of something happening. Something remarkable being communicated. As I said at the end of that seminar in 1980, I just felt I had to ask for an ordination, commit myself to a life in the Dharma. So yeah, the sense of a life-changing communication. And I think the value of study like this is that we can actually, you know, through engaging with those teachings, we can touch back into something of that vital, vivid, alive communication. So in our imagination this afternoon, or this session, we're going back to 11th century Tibet, and we're meeting Rechungpa, one of Milarepa's heart disciples. So Rechungpa was brilliant, spiritually gifted, but he wasn't an easy disciple. You may have heard of Gampopa, who was another of the great disciples of Milarepa. He was a good monk, a much more straightforward, straight down the line sort of practitioner. He was one of the great founders of the Kagyu tradition. Milarepa had to work a lot harder with Rechungpa. He was brilliant, but he knew it, and he was quite wayward. I mean, I guess a few of us probably like to think we're a bit like Rechungpa, you know. Whether or not we are is another question. So in the story that we're taking the extracts from today, Rechungpa is on his way back from India. He's maybe been there a few years. I think it is at least his second trip. And he's been studying with some of the great teachers of India, doctrine, philosophy, logic, and he's also received various initiations, and he's bringing back with him a bag full of texts, including some esoteric texts that go with the initiations he's received. Milarepa sees in a vision that Rechungpa is on his way, and he sees that he's suffering from pride. So he goes to meet him, and they meet. And we find Rechungpa thinking, I'm much more learned in Buddhist philosophy than Milarepa now. And he's hoping, expecting that Milarepa will show him deep respect and at least treat him as an equal. But no chance. So Rechungpa prostrates to Milarepa. Milarepa does not prostrate back to Rechungpa. So all these thoughts of Rechungpa's are going on in his mind, but he greets Milarepa very politely, asks after his health, asks where he's been staying, asks how his brother disciples are doing, where they're going to go next. So outwardly, he's behaving like a very good disciple. But Milarepa knows exactly what's going on in Rechungpa's mind. And in response to Rechungpa's questions about his health and so on, he sings, I am a yogi who lives on a snow mountain peak. With a healthy body, I glorify the mandala of the whole. Cleansed of vanity from the 5 poisons, I am not unhappy. I feel naught but joy. Renouncing all turmoil and fondness for diversion, I reside alone in perfect ease. So over the rest of this seminar, we're going to be looking at these lines and Bhante's commentary on them. So just a few lines of a song, but there's a huge amount in them. So we're following this principle of more and more, of less and less. So Milarepa says, cleansed of vanity from the 5 poisons, I am not unhappy. I feel naught but joy. So Milarepa seems to be talking, singing about himself. But actually what he's doing is holding up a mirror to Rechungpa. Rechungpa is not joyful or happy. He's very much caught up in pride and vanity, and he isn't free of the poisons. He's been all the way to India. He's received all sorts of teachings and initiations. He knows a lot, and he's got a big pile of books to prove it. And it's going to take a while, we find, for Milarepa to actually get through to Rechungpa before Rechungpa's willing to look into the mirror that Milarepa is holding up for him. A bit later on in the story, Milarepa sends Rechungpa off to fetch some water. And while he's fetching water, he gets caught up in a sort of dream vision, watching wild asses that just seem to be reproducing incredibly quickly. And he just gets completely sort of caught up in this vision, which Milarepa probably had something to do with. And he only comes to when one of the asses seems to turn into a wolf and chase the others all away. So he goes off back, and as he comes closer to where he left Milarepa, he sniffs something in the air, smoke. Smells like paper burning. And he begins to wonder, oh dear, oh no. He hurries back, and there is Milarepa happily burning his books. He's shocked, horrified, annoyed, and he falls into a great big sulk. He won't talk to Milarepa. Milarepa does all sorts of things to try and engage with him. He even flies around on a boulder. But Rechungpa isn't interested. All he wants is his books back. So we find Milarepa in these verses speaking directly to Rechungpa, and we could say also to us. He's challenging us to look at how we're not yet free of pride coming from the 5 poisons. Challenging us to look at the lack of joy in our lives coming out of that. So with the help of Bhante's commentary, let's just have a look at these poisons and try to get some sense of what they are pointing to. And then we can see how we can use these teachings to help us to get to grip with the tendencies the poisons represent in us. So Bhante points to the traditional distinction between the 5 hindrances we meet in meditation and the poison. So one of the first things we probably learn coming along to a Triratna center, learning to meditate, is about the 5 hindrances. These tendencies that get in the way of our ability to meditate more deeply. Desire for sensuous experience, aversion, restlessness and worry, sloth and torpor, doubt and indecision. And we learn various methods to suspend or bypass the hindrances so that we can develop some more expansive, clearer states of mind, what's known as samatha. But the point that Bhante really brings out here is the hindrances are really a much more superficial manifestation of the poisons. We can suspend them in order to develop more positive, expansive, bright states of mind, calmer states of mind that enable us then to go deeper and begin to actually see more into these underlying patterns of the poisons, begin to see through them with insight, vipassana, so that we start to become freer of them. And we should never underestimate the power of the kleshas. They're the forces in us that have driven the story of the human race, and they drive us now. It's all too easy to project the poisons out there. You know, we can see so many terrible things going on in the world. It's very easy to see the greed, the hatred, the ignorance, and so on out there, and fail to really recognize them in ourselves, at play in ourselves. And in failing to really recognize them and acknowledge them, we're left actually very vulnerable to them and being taken over by them. So the three root poisons or kleshas are greed, hatred, and delusion. Again, you're probably all familiar with the cock, the pig, and the snake at the center of the wheel of life, eating each other's tails, feeding off each other, right at the hub of the wheel of samsara, driving it round. So Milarepa speaks of 5 poisons, and Bhante goes in the commentary into the various lists that we can find in the Buddhist tradition. And it is helpful to know that none of these lists is actually definitive. They're all tools to help us on our path, all very useful in sort of naming the enemy so we can start to become free of them and their hold over us. You know, there's these fairy tales where if you can just name, you know, the wicked dwarf or whatever, you know, Rumpelstiltskin, once you name them, they lose their power. And if we can actually begin to name these forces at play in us, we begin to be able to objectify them and to become freer of them. So as well as greed, hatred, and delusion, the traditional list of the poisons can often include conceit, which is the tendency to think we're better, worse, or equal to others. And envy. Envy being this form of hatred that springs from one's displeasure at the success, achievement, honor, or goodness of others. And we could see it as a potent mix of greed, hatred, and ignorance. But again, it's a tendency deep and universal enough to be named as the klesha, as a poison in its own right. And sometimes we find a list where instead of envy, distraction is named as the 5th klesha. Again, distraction shouldn't be thought of here in a superficial way. You know, it's not just, with the remote control flicking between TV channels, or, you know, going from Facebook to Twitter to the news to wherever, having a snack, you know, that sort of superficial distraction. distraction here as a poison is the manifestation of something again more fundamental. You could say the constant scrabbling around for something, anything, in a desperate attempt to anchor that sense of self, of me, of mine, find stability in the ever-shifting sands of life. So yes, again, echoing Bhante, we should never underestimate the poisons. You know, we're not just talking about irritating habits here, but deep, powerful forces at play in us, which we could say are us, and which we need to get to grips with if we're going to get anywhere in the spiritual life. So to further help us get a sense of how we might go about this, Bhante brings in another traditional teaching, that of the two veils or coverings, the klehsa varana, the veil of defilements, and the jnaya varana, the veil of knowables, sometimes just spoken of as the veil of views. So we could speak of emotional obscurations and intellectual obscurations. In the sense, intellectual obscurations in the sense of wrong conceptions that obscure the truth. So Bhante points out that all the kleshas, the poisons, will have some emotional and some intellectual aspect to them. But some of them are more of the nature of raw emotion, often the case with hatred. Others are more intellectual. So yeah, intellectual doesn't mean rational, but rather backed up by, fed by the stories we weave around and tell ourselves. So for example, conceit is seen as a more intellectual klesha because there we're constantly comparing ourselves with others. I'm like this, they're like that. This is a good thing, this is a bad thing, and so on. So this is something to explore. Can we see how it might be helpful to recognize where we may be driven more by raw emotion and where the stories that we weave feed and reinforce those forces and are very much a part of them. So today, let's see if we can get a clearer focus on understanding of these kleshas, these powerful forces of greed, hatred, delusion, conceit, envy, or distraction. Can we recognize them in ourselves?